Good evening, everybody. I hope only to speak for, let's just say, half an hour, so that will leave plenty of time for discussion. There are two huge areas to cover: early life issues and end of life issues, and you may be interested in one and not the other. So the discussion can take, I hope we'll cover aspects of both. Does the name Louise Brown ring a bell with anybody here? Ah, it does, yes. Well, she must be about 33 or 34. She was the first person who was born as a result of in vitro fertilization some 30 odd years ago, when Dr. Steptoe and Edwards put together the sperm and the egg outside the womb, and then after various procedures implanted the fertilized egg in the womb, and Louise Brown was the result. In vitro fertilization, Latin word, in the kind of glass receptacle, if you like, in the test tube, rather than in vivo fertilization, alive in the womb. So most extraordinary developments have taken place since then. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. It's possible now for a couple who know that one of them is a carrier of cystic fibrosis, a terrible disease as a result of which most people die in their teens or in their 20s, to produce a number of fertilized eggs, for these to be looked at, for the clinician to spot which one will not have cystic fibrosis, and then reimplant that egg in the womb. And that technique of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is now available for a whole range of conditions which were life-threatening or totally debilitating. If a couple is infertile, it is possible to have an egg fertilized by a donor sperm. If it is a wife that is infertile, it is possible for someone else's egg to be fertilized by her partner's sperm. If the mother is not able to bear a womb herself, it is possible for a surrogate mother to bear her child. Her husband and the husband and wife, or the couple, can fertilize an egg with their own sperm and their own egg, and this can be planted in the womb of another woman who will bear the child for them. It's now possible to store eggs, so that a woman perhaps in her 20s might have a number of her eggs stored and decide only to have a child, let us say, when she is in her 40s. And it is possible, as you will have read in the newspapers, for much older women, as a result of that and similar techniques, to have children. And there's been the most amazing spin-offs since all this, connected with embryo research. You may have read perhaps about, 5 or 6 years ago now, that there was a huge debate in this country about the production of stem cell lines, using fertilized eggs in a particular way in order to produce stem cell lines, which it was believed, and is still believed, if injected into people, might be able to, as it were, restore their own cells which in some way were diseased or dying. It is now possible to mix human embryonic material, human material with animal material to produce what are called human admixed embryos. This has not been licensed yet for a treatment, but when I was on the Human Fertilization and Embryology, we licensed research on this. What this means, there's a terrible disease called mitochondria, which I won't go into the scientific technicalities, because even if I once knew it, it'll probably slip away from me. But it basically means taking an animal egg and fertilizing it with human sperm and the mother's egg as well, so that, as it were, this fertilized egg just gets a little bit of an animal boost to launch it in its life. Now, those are just some of the amazing things, and I'm not going to go on about all those, because we're here to discuss some of the ethics. I just thought we ought to have some kind of picture of what we're talking about. This obviously raises very, very major questions about the moral status of the early embryo. This little early embryo, as a result of in vitro fertilization, we have to face the fact a good number of fertilized eggs will usually be lost. I've already indicated that people are willing to research on this very early embryo. What is this very early embryo? Is it a human being, or is it a potential human being? How are we to treat it? Well, the Roman Catholic view is absolutely crystal clear. From the moment of fertilization, that fertilized egg is to be accorded the full rights of a human person. So the Roman Catholic Church is, of course, not only totally opposed to any kind of abortion, even if the mother's life is in danger, totally opposed to in vitro fertilization and all those techniques that flow from it. But the Roman Catholic view, as I've stated it, and we receive it today, in fact, dates from 1869 and Pope Pius IX. And there is an alternative view in the Church, which goes back at least to the 4th and 5th century. This alternative view makes a distinction between the moral status of the very early embryo and the moral status of the fetus as it's later developed in the womb. How do we know this? Because we know, not only from the canon law of the Middle Ages, but from what are called the penitentials, that is, the guides to confessors in the period, as to what the penalties were for abortion. If the abortion was late, the penalty was regarded as killing. If the abortion was very early, first 3 months, it was regarded as very serious. It was a sin. It was a sin, there's no doubt about it. But it was not regarded of the same kind of gravity as abortion later on. So they made a distinction. Why did they make a distinction? They made a distinction, first of all, because of a particular reading of a text in the Old Testament that I won't go into because it's a bit technical, but they had a particular text of the Old Testament in an old translation that enabled them to do this. More important was the philosophical background dating from the time of Aristotle, with what is called delayed ensoulment. They believed that the soul entered the body later, and the soul entered the body 40 days after fertilization for a male, and wait for it, 90 days or so after fertilization for a female. And it was that philosophical background, I think, more than anything else, which enabled them to make a moral distinction between the early and the later stages. Now, obviously, we don't believe in delayed ensoulment today. We don't think in that kind of way at all. But I think the importance of both the church practice at that time is revealed by the penitentials and the canon law, and the philosophical background is that it indicated a more gradualist approach, which I would suggest actually accords with the basic gut feelings of most human beings. Now, there are other arguments to justify this more gradualist view, one of which is we now know that well over 2/3 of fertilized eggs are lost in the usual process of events in nature anyway. Nature is very prodigal. The vast majority of fertile eggs are lost anyway. Some of them, quite rightly, because they would not have survived very long, or they would grow up very malformed, or whatever it might be. Now that, for me, poses problems, and I'm sorry for stating it rather crudely, but it does bring the point home. If each one of those fertilized eggs is an eternal soul, then it means that heaven will be overwhelmingly populated by people who've never been born. And that seems to me to be a reductio ad absurdum. I just cannot cope with that thought at all. We have, I think, therefore, to take a more gradualist view. And the second reason is that although that early embryo is a potential person does not have all the rights that a person does when their full potentiality has been actualized. We see this in ordinary everyday life in all sorts of ways. A full-grown oak has a preservation order put on it, but underneath the oak there are hundreds of thousands of acorns that are just stamped into the ground. A medical student is a potential doctor, but they only become a doctor at a particular point. So there are also those kind of considerations. Now, the actual situation in this country is as a result of those the early developments with Louise Brown. The government set up a working party chaired by Baroness Warnock, which reported in 1984, which made a number of basic and fundamental recommendations, which passed into law in the 1990 Human Fertilization and Embryology Act, which as a result of new legislation in response to all the scientific developments since then, resulted in the act which we have today, which is the 2008-9 Embryology Act. And the fundamental principle behind that is that although the early embryo is not accorded the full rights of an adult person, nevertheless it is to be accorded respect, and that respect is to be safeguarded. And in order to ensure that that respect was safeguarded, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority was set up in order to license and regulate all fertility clinics, to license and regulate all research, and nothing can happen in this field without being accounted for. We have, I think it is generally reckoned around the world, by far the best system of regulation in this field, and we're very often looked at with envy by other countries. So that is something about the status of the early embryo. I should just mention one other point in connection with that, which I perhaps should have made a bit clearer at the beginning, and that is, when I talk about the early embryo, I'm talking about from 0 to 14 days. Why 14 days? Well, at that point, or about that point, if you look at the fertilized egg, there develops a little streak. That is the beginning of the nervous system, what's called the primitive streak. And after that point, that fertilized egg will become an individual human being. Before that point, that bundle of multiplying cells, smaller than a pinhead, will go to form the placenta, the umbilical cord, and could divide to form 2 or 3. But we know that once that primitive streak is there, the beginning of the nervous system, and at that point, under normal circumstances, that fertilized egg will be in the womb. From that point, there is a human individual and a potential person. Now, there's one other aspect of this, and that is, there was an old rhyme, if you remember, that said that love and marriage went together like a horse and carriage. Well, in those days, Love and marriage led to sexual intercourse. Sexual intercourse led to the woman being pregnant, and that woman bore her child. That nexus has been broken at almost every point, as you will already have gathered by what I said at the beginning, because you can have donor sperm, donor eggs, you can have surrogacy, and so on. So that nexus has been broken in potential at every point. Now, of course, those of us, who are brought up in a different age, like myself, sort of have a sense of shock about all these developments. But if you think about it, although women do not have the right to have a child, and you very often hear people saying women haven't got a right to have a child, nobody has a right to have a child. Would it not be true to say that women have the right to try to have a child if they want one? I put that as a question mark. What I do know is that tens and tens of thousands of couples, perhaps more, hundreds of thousands now, have received huge blessing as a result of these medical techniques springing from the beginning of in vitro fertilization those years ago. And these techniques are more and more in demand because, of course, you'll all know from yourselves or your children or your grandchildren, people are marrying much later. In our days, we got married in our early 20s. We had a number of children by the time we were mid-20s. Now, couples don't get married or settle down until their mid-30s. They don't start thinking about having children until their late 40s, late 30s. And of course, by that time, it's much more difficult to conceive. Fertility isn't so powerful. And so lots and lots of couples in sort of late 30s now are seeking treatment or help through these with their fertility. One other final point before moving on to the other aspect of this evening, and that is people might have a sort of gut feeling and think to themselves, this is all unnatural. This is all unnatural. But we need to think clearly about what is natural. What is natural for us human beings, who God has given brains, to whom God has given ingenuity? Is it not natural for us human beings to use our God-given brains and our God-given ingenuity to work with and through nature in order to enhance human well-being? Is that not what is natural for us human beings? How are we doing with time? Anybody? What? Wait, yeah. What's the time now?
It's coming up.
It's coming up. I've already had my half an hour. I better go on and talk a little bit about assisted dying and the end-of-life issues, because I think some people here might be more interested in those. I'm not looking at anybody in particular. Remarkably young-looking group, I can tell you. Let me make one or two preliminary points about how the Church approaches this issue, and there's total unanimity on this between the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. The first is that nobody is under a duty or an obligation to prolong their own life at any cost. There was a 19th century agnostic poet called Arthur Clough, who was quoted out of context by a previous pope to the effect, "Thou shalt not kill, but need not strive officiously to keep alive." So that sums up a very sound element of Catholic teaching. We are not under a duty to prolong our own life at all costs. We are not under a duty to accept burdensome treatment if it is too burdensome. We have an absolute right to refuse burdensome treatment. That's the first fundamental point. The second fundamental point is the principle of double effect, which applies in all sorts of areas of ethics. It is simply to the effect that sometimes what you're trying to achieve, which is good, has some foreseen but unintended consequences. And where it bites at this time is if you give a person a dose of morphine in order to stop the pain, but as a result of that, their life is shortened, that is an entirely morally right thing to do. Because the purpose is to stop the pain, to make the person comfortable. And that is regarded at that stage of life, if a person is towards the end of life, as a greater good than a few extra days or weeks of their life. So that principle of double effect is very, very important. Some people like to blur the distinction, and there are people with serious philosophical positions, particular people who are thoroughgoing utilitarians don't accept the principle of double effect. But it is fundamental to Christian moral theology, both Catholic and Anglican. The third point is that you're both legally entitled and morally entitled to draw up a living will, to say that under certain circumstances you do not wish your life to go on being, you don't want to go on being kept alive. You can say, for example, that if you're on a life support machine, at some stage when you're not able to answer yourself, you don't want to be kept alive on a life support machine. It's an entirely proper thing, morally and legally proper thing to do. And one final sort of preamble, and that is palliative care in this country now is hugely better than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And one of the aspects of this that the Christian Church is going to be hugely proud of is the way they have pioneered and initiated palliative care. It all began with the work of a Christian doctor in South London called Dame Cicely Saunders with her St Christopher's Hospice. Some people will have heard of it, some to have, where she pioneered serious palliative care, which was based upon two fundamental principles, one scientific and one spiritual. The scientific one was that if you give people the right dose of drugs at the right time, at regular intervals, not simply waiting until people are in agony, you can actually keep the vast, vast majority of people out of pain. You keep them comfortable. Second principle was that if you put people into loving, supportive, prayerful environment, they no longer say, let me out of this. So palliative care, which is now available, not to the same high quality all over the country, but it is hugely better in every other place. Now, when we come to those hard cases, and we've all read about them in the newspapers, and you may know them from your own experience, we're very, very moved by somebody who knows that they have this debilitating illness which is only going to get worse. It's going to leave them in a very, what they feel, dependent and undignified position. And we feel for people like that. And all I can say is that if I was in that position, I wouldn't know how I would respond. I don't approach this with any sense of moral superiority. I don't know how I would respond if I was in that kind of position. Don't know what my reaction would be. That's a kind of preliminary to this. Second preliminary point I think I would make is that my particular approach to this does not depend upon a command ethics, as though God has forbidden us to do this, or there is some other kind of law, moral law, which stops us doing it. I don't think that's a very helpful way to think these days. The argument might or might not be valid, but I'm not myself using it. I want to use wider considerations. First of all, when a person says, well, you know, you wouldn't treat a dog like this. Dogs are put down. Why can't I be put down? That's a very heartfelt plea. But I think we have to beware of thinking that just because a person asks for something, it's necessarily right to give them what they ask. If a distressed 17-year-old comes up to you and asks you to help them kill themselves, you quite rightly would refuse. You would try to do your best to get them some appropriate help, some appropriate medical help, or some appropriate counselling. So all I would say as a basic best of friend, just because a person asks for something, that is not in itself a reason for giving them what they want. Now, when we look at other parts of the world where assisted dying has been legalized, places like Oregon in the United States and the Netherlands, for example, what the research shows is that the kind of people who avail themselves of assisted dying when it is legally available are people, on the whole, with a professional background, people who are used to being in charge of their life, in control of their life, and who, understandably, can't bear the thought of not being in control of their life towards the end. And I can sympathize with that. I'm the kind of person, like most of us here, likes to be in control of our life. But if we have that picture in our mind, I think we can perhaps subject it to a certain amount of these cross-examination. I think, first of all, that it reveals a very, very individualistic view of what it is to be a human being. I think that from a Christian point of view, we are only persons in and through our relationship with other persons. And the Africans have a much better sense of this with their word Ubuntu. To be a person is to be a person only in and through and with other people. Or, as a great theologian, Anglican theologian Austin Farrer once put it, mind is a social reality. Mind is a social reality. And this picture of human beings as essentially isolated and in control of their own destinies, a sort of isolated being, is very much a product of European thought since the 17th century. And I think is false to a Christian understanding of what it is, which sees being a human being in relationship terms. Secondly, there is all through our life a changing relationship between dependent and being independent. At the beginning of our life, of course, we're totally dependent on other people, and we are, whatever state we're in, at the end of our life, at least most of us. For a lot of our middle period of our life, we're independent, and we're helping other people who are dependent on us. There's this shifting balance. Now, one of the implications of this, for me, is that we shouldn't think we somehow lose our humanity if we become more and more dependent on other people. But this sort of polarity of dependence-independence is part of what it is to be a human being, and it shifts its balance in different courses of our lives. And it is false to think that it's only when we're independent that we're being truly human. And the third implication of that, of course, is that if we do become very dependent on others, that in no way means that we lose our dignity or our human worth. Even if a person is totally helpless and dependent on others, from a Christian point of view, they retain their human dignity and worth, and that must be recognized and respected as such. And I think that the point of having a law which forbids euthanasia, which forbids people helping others to die, is that it expresses society's view that whatever state a person is in, whatever state of dependence or incapacity, society is somehow conveying a message saying you are of worth, you are of value. And in relation to those very hard cases, and they are very, very hard cases, I think the situation is now better with the new guidelines which have been issued by the Director of Public Prosecution. The Director of Public Prosecution has issued a whole series of guidelines, and if certain criteria are met, although a person has broken the law, they won't be prosecuted. So if it's found that a person has helped another person to die, but they had no financial inducement, the other person had pleaded with them over a very, very long period, etc., etc. If all those, what you might compassionate considerations, were clearly to the fore, then although the person has broken the law, they won't be prosecuted. And I think myself that the kind of balance which we have at the moment in our society, where we have a law against euthanasia or assisted dying, but where in really hard cases, where clearly the motive and the circumstances is simply compassion all the way through, the person is not subjected to the further hurt and harm and anguish of prosecution and imprisonment. So I am in favour of retaining the law at the moment, together with the guidelines which we have from the Director of Public Prosecution. So I think I will end what I want to say at that point in order to open up the discussion on any of those huge issues of life and death. Over to you, folks. There's a lady there, yes?
What do you feel about like babies that are born, like say at 22 weeks, and they say that the baby's not really able to support itself? I mean, to like it's been born early and it's not really like functioning properly. And some people say that if baby's born at 22 weeks, should be left just to die, and they won't be having too much.
Well, this is one of the really, really hard issues, because we know, through the advances in medical technique, there's now the ability to keep babies alive in a way that was not possible. 20 years ago they would have died. Now it's possible. But the great problem, of course, is that babies are born at that age, as you're implying, have a very, very high likelihood of handicap, and their lives are likely to be very, very precarious. So I don't myself think that there's any real guidance there. It has general guidance. I mean, I think the doctors have to make the decision at that time. Obviously, the doctors will do their best to keep a baby alive. The law requires them to do so. And I think that's really what that's what has to say. But sometimes, of course, the impairment and the difficulty of the baby is such that, of course, they don't live. But it is very, very tricky because of a very high percentage of handicap when that happens.
Sir, would you like to see an organisation like Dignitas set up in this country?
No, I wouldn't, for the reasons that I've stated, because I'm in favour of the present law, which says that helping somebody else to die is a criminal offence. So the reasons I've stated, I think that it's helpful to have that law there, even though it does make some hard cases. But there is huge pressure. There is huge pressure. The lobby in favour of what used to be called euthanasia, but is now usually called assisted dying, is very, very strong. They never lose an opportunity to publicise their case. In the last 2 years in the House of Lords, they brought forward 2 bills to try to legalise euthanasia or assisted dying, both of which were heavily defeated in the House of Lords. But they claim, I think probably rightly, that they have the public on their side. I mean, certainly I was speaking on this subject at the Bath Literary Festival a couple of weeks ago, which we had must have had 400 or 500 people there. 85% of the audience there were opposed to my point of view. Now, of course, it may be that the pro-euthanasia lobby have got their followers turned out. I think there does seem to be quite a lot of support in the general public. And in fairness, I should say, there is a Christian case for assisted dying. It's been put forward by Paul Badham, who was a liberal theologian known to some of us. It's a good book, it's available in paperback. He argues from a Christian point of view that it would be much better for people to be allowed to help other people die in a way which was humane and legal. Hands popping up all over. There's a gentleman.
Let's read first, and then
Right.
and the second one back.
Right.
Probably just a slight observation. I like your point very much that by having a law against assisted dying, it's a statement of society that we care about people.
Yeah.
I think unfortunately, we're not very perfect in the way that we do care about
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
And I think the reality of what some people face actually doesn't follow through a statement of society caring about people. I think sometimes people might want to die because they know or they fear that they won't be cared for and looked after in that tendency in a way that we would like to know that they were cared for.
I know what you're saying, but the evidence seems to be that at least the well-publicised cases, they are people who are being cared for. They are people who are being cared for, but they are people, and I can't understand and sympathise with this. You know, faced with one of these motor neurone diseases, they don't want to end their life in that state of total incapacity, and they don't want to inflict the burden of that on their nearest and dearest. But I don't think it's not that they won't be. I don't think it's the fear of not being cared for. Myself, I don't think it is that.
Is there not a little bit of a paradox there with the Christian thinking? Because for the Christian, death is also a goal,
Yeah.
and we're expecting something. So, say someone was mentally aware, fully aware, but on their body they were dying slowly, long. If that person was a Christian, they were hoping for the resurrection, and they were ready to go. How would not be Christian of euthanasia in that case?
Well, that is the argument put forward by Paul Badham. Yes, I mean there is a Christian. That's what he says. You know, Christians believe in an afterlife, and we've got something to look forward to. And I can see the rational point of that. But I suppose that I take the view that so long as we're in this life, it may be that God is trying to draw something good out of the situation that we are in. That no situation is totally hopeless, that some good is coming out of where I am in the here and now. And I think the other thing is, if you're asking somebody else to help you on your way out of this life, what kind of message is it really sending to them? Because normally if you love somebody, one of the implications then is you want them with you. you don't want to hasten them out of the here and now. And so if you accede to their request, to help them to die, what signal? I'm putting that simply as a question mark. What is that sending a signal to them?
But the Christian mystics, they seem to will for death, no? So
Yes.
they will be sending this message as well.
Yes,
while they're-
yes, they do. Well, a lot of them do. But I don't think any of them would have taken the view that they should, as it were, take steps to hasten their time out of this. I mean, after all, St. Paul said, it's far better for me to die and be with Christ, but for your sake, I must stay here. That's what he said. And that slightly links it with my first point. It may be hard though it is that maybe that God is bringing something good out of this. We've all really experienced it. I experienced it in a less extreme form than most with my mother, who had a terrible stroke and lost her speech virtually entirely, and was in that state for about sort of 5 years. And she was a very strong-willed person. She found it just totally frustrating. But did I want to hasten her out of this life? No. And was it a time when nothing came out of it? No. Something did come out of it. The family were able to express care. I think she knew who she was cared for. That doesn't make it better. I'm not saying that it outweighs all the frustration and suffering that she had to go through. But it wasn't a total waste. It wasn't totally futile.
I could rationalise that as an entirely selfish view. He didn't want to be without her mum. He wanted to keep her going as long as possible, even because life her mother was very poor.
But she had a strong will to live. She wasn't asking to go. She was just frustrated that she couldn't speak and she couldn't live the active life that she'd had before. She didn't resign herself to it. She expressed no desire.
There were 3 more in the queue. There's Lisa, Tim, and then Justin.
No, yes. Never Let Me Go, yes.
I found it very, very disturbing.
I found it very disturbing.
I just wondered what you thought about it.
No, I found it very, very disturbing, and I didn't want to see the film because I found the book so disturbing. No, very, very, very disturbing. Yeah.
Has anyone else read the book or seen the film?
I've read it.
I found it very disturbing. I wondered whether you thought we would ever get ourselves into that kind of situation, looking at the current level, the speed of medical advances on cell technology. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for those, actually, we better not explain what the book is about in case. But let us just say that it is the novel depicts a situation in which human beings are totally instrumentalized. There's groups of human beings that are born and bred simply to be used for other people. They're being used as a means to an end, whereas absolutely fundamental to human life from a Christian point of view is that we treat people as ends in themselves, not simply as means to an end. I don't think we will ever get like that. I mean, the law is very firm. We could only get, I think we could only get like that in a society which was total despotism or total tyranny. I think a democratic society, or perhaps I'm being too optimistic about democratic society. Well, let's just say that at the moment the law is really pretty strict in all these sort of areas. And although there is what's called the slippery slope argument, and sometimes we have to take the slippery slope arguments seriously, slippery slope argument, says that if you allow one thing, it will inevitably follow follow this, that and the other. We have to take that seriously. But I think that the law is really tight enough that we won't go down that road.
Please stop here.
No.
Tim.
Just a couple of points. First, in the beginning of life, this isn't an original point at all, but I don't have a really satisfactory answer to it, which is, here I am today, and I trace myself back in time.
Yeah.
I can see. And when did I cease to be me?
Well, you weren't you before the formation of the primitive streak. From about 14 days, and the law makes it 14 days because within a tiny margin, that's the time when the primitive streak is formed, and the law needs to be clear. So nothing can happen, no research on embryos, nothing after 14 days. It can only happen before 14 days. After 14 days, as I say, there is unbroken continuity between this developing fetus and you. There's an unbroken continuity.
Is there now unbroken continuity between conception and 14 days?
No. You have a bundle of cells, some of which go to the placenta, some to the umbilical cord, and some which split into to twins or triplets or what. You don't have a single individual. What you can say is that you came from that bundle of cells.
Yes.
But then so did a lot of other things.
Yes, but I was obviously from that bundle.
You were from that bundle of cells, yes.
The second thing is, in the later end of life, do we need to get hung up on whether it's moral, immoral in certain situations, particular cases of individuals, as to whether it's right or wrong to assist their death, or whatever? Isn't this simply a matter of law? And the law, quite sensibly, and I agree with you entirely, the law quite sensibly looks at the general picture.
Yes.
And says generally it is in the interest of the vulnerable in society, and they, usually older people, that you have law and people at least have the risk of prosecution, even if they're not actually prosecuted, if they go down that road. And, if they do, they know they're taking, because even the present guidelines, they're not, you don't have a tooth guarantee, they're guidelines.
Well,
And that seems to me all you need to say is it's a legal matter.
there's a moral side as well as a legal side. But I agree with you. I agree with you. That's the case I've stated. The case against it is that those people who decide to defy the law have to go to all the trouble of going to Switzerland, usually. It usually means that they probably have to go before was really necessary, because there might come a stage where they weren't able to go physically. They involve their nearest and dearest in all the business of taking them over to Switzerland. So the argument of Dignitas and people is that it would be much more compassionate to have a system in this country which meant that they didn't have to go through all that, and they, as it were, could leave it until the last moment. And again, to be fair to both sides of the argument, the research in Oregon, where they have this, I think they call it, is it death with dignity? I can't remember what their law is, but the system there is that you register your wish to die, or to have assistance in dying, and you can collect the medicines, but quite a high percentage of people who register the wish and, as it were, have everything available don't go through with it. And the advocates of that system say what it has given them reassurance. It's taken away the sense of panic. They know that if things got too bad, it would be all right. They could act quickly. It gives them reassurance. So it doesn't. That's. I can see how in that sort of. I can see how that is a good effect of that particular system.
We're not going to get too far because Tim is a lawyer.
Right?
Let's give it to Justin.
My question relates in part to Tim's first question. I'm just interested in looking at science through theological eyes. You say that personhood begins with, is it the primary street you call it?
The primitive street.
Primitive street.
Yeah. Well, I didn't say personhood is a tricky word, how you define personhood. That's a very contentious issue. The phrase I used was human individual. You are one human individual. And human there is simply being defined that you have the physical characteristics of a human being.
Okay, that's partly what I'm trying to understand. Is we consider it from the point of view that every human being is created in the image of God and therefore carries an inalienable dignity.
Yes.
Are we able to theologically sort of marry up science? What I'm trying to ask. You know, do we say that at that point this bundle of cells becomes a human being, is endowed with dignity in the way that we would see it theologically, and so on? I just thought, is that too crude?
No, I mean, these are very, very tricky issues, and the great advantage of the Roman Catholic position is absolutely crystal clear.
Sure.
Moment of fertilization, that's it. And that is clear, the moment of fertilization. You could say that the 14-day point at least has a certain kind of clarity to it, or implantation in the womb. But once the fetus has been implanted in the womb, it's very difficult to draw hard and fast distinctions relating the ethics or the theology to the science. Obviously, one important point is when this fetus is capable of feeling pain. Well, that's a contentious issue where, but that's clearly something. I mean, the way I view it is, God has made us for relationship, and what makes us human, or defines our humanity, really is our capacity for relationship. Now, when does that begin? Clearly, in the womb, there's the beginning of a relationship between what's in the womb and the mother. I mean, there's a beginning of a relationship there, isn't it? But it's certainly not a conscious relationship on the part of the fetus. But then you can say the same again for a newborn baby. You know, the newborn baby can't think in a rational kind of way. But of course, the law needs to be clear, and so the law takes the line that when that baby comes out of the womb, whether it's 22 weeks, 24 weeks, or 28, whatever, that what you have there must be accorded the full respect of a human being. But clearly it's not based simply upon rational personhood at that point. Now there is a big debate as to whether you define the human life in biological terms or more in biographical terms. I think the Roman Catholic position is one really based on biological terms. When you actually have the physical being there, you have a person. The most sort of skeptical secular kind of point of view would be the opposite extreme. It's only really when you have rational personhood that you really can properly speak, or when you have the capacity for rationality, that you can only properly speak of a person. So there's this oscillating tension between whether you take a biographical view or a biological view of what it is to be a human person. I'll have to leave it at that, I think.
We've come now really to the end of our time. Let's one more question. No, I won't let it leave it too long, because we've got an opportunity now to have some coffee and tea, and let's ask for a couple of volunteers to help, please, in the kitchen, if you could, move to the back of the church. Can I say thank you very much indeed to Lord Harries, and may I say God help all those who have to follow him, because you've set that it's almost impossible to live up to that, and I knew that we were going to be really lucky when we got to you, and I repeat again how fortunate we are to have you take time and trouble to
Well, a lot of intelligent, probing, difficult questions left hovering in the air.
Well, we have to preach to them Sunday by Sunday and then go to sleep. Next week we're going to be dealing with biblical ethics. We've got Sean Doherty, who is from St. Wolitis College, and he will be talking about all the knotty problems in biblical ethics. But now it would be appropriate if we gave Lord Harries